It was a bad week for referees. It was very sad to hear about the passing of former WWE referees Tim White and Dave Hebner, who each passed away within a day or two of one another. Tim White was 68 years old, started with WWE way back in 1982. He was working the merchandise booth. They used to travel with the events, started as a referee for them a few years later. He never planned to get into the wrestling business. He only took the job as a way to make some money and kill some time before entering the FBI Academy at Quantico. At least that was his plan. He wanted to be an officer of the law. And 20 years later, he was still working in the wrestling business. He was still working for WWE until they released him in 2009. So he spent a very long time working in that company as a referee, but also in other roles behind the scenes. He would be with the wrestlers when it came to signings and appearances. And even after that, I think, you would see him at WWE events and he would be helping out at some of those signings. I don't know if he was working for them in an official capacity or unofficially at that point. I met him at the airport in New Orleans, WrestleMania 30 weekend. I got to chat with him for a couple of minutes. Really nice guy. And by all accounts, and I see all the tweets that all the wrestlers are putting out, Big E had a very nice message about him. Everybody seems to be in agreement. Not a bad word to be said about Tim White. As far as his career, the match that he would be most associated with, the match that he would probably have said would be the most famous of the ones that he worked, was the Hell in a Cell match. The most infamous, maybe you could use that word for it, Hell in a Cell match in WWE history. Between the Undertaker and Mankind back in 1998, he was in the cell. When Foley fell through the top of the cage and he had to go over and check on him and make sure he was still breathing and make sure he was still okay. Undertaker's telling him, go check on him, make sure he's alive. Tim White was the one who was in the ring. It was Judgment Day 2002, speaking of Hell in a Cell. There was another cell match. This one was between Triple H and Chris Jericho. That was the night that Tim White suffered what ultimately would prove to be a career-ending injury. And it was in one of his books, I don't remember which one. Chris Jericho, it was either the second or third book, noted that the plan was they wanted to come up with a way for he and Triple H to get outside the cell. And Tim White was the referee for the match. And Jericho said that, White had agreed that Jericho would knock him off the ring apron. He would collide with the side of the cage. That would take him out of the picture for a while. And then when help finally arrived to help Tim White, Triple H and Jericho would use that as an opportunity to brawl outside the cage, and they would, make their way up to the top of the cell. Well, when he collided with the cage, he suffered a really bad dislocation of the shoulder. It was a really bad injury. I don't believe he came back from the injury. I think it was about 2 years. Because I believe it was the Chris Jericho Christian match at WrestleMania 20. That was his first match back. And on the final 3 count of the match, when Christian won, is when Tim White's shoulder went out again. And at that point, he realized he wasn't going to be able to be a referee anymore. That was pretty much the end of his in-ring career. And he was more of a backstage presence from that point on for the company. The other thing that he would be most associated with would be Andre the Giant. And he has talked about this over the years. He was interviewed for the Andre documentary that aired on HBO. I think that was the Bill Simmons documentary a few years ago. He was basically Andre's best friend. And his handler, he helped make Andre's life easier on the road. And this is going back to the mid-'80s. When he and Andre first became friends and they established that relationship and he was known as Andre's handler or assistant or whatever word you want to use, his right-hand man, this is going back to the mid-'80s. And the saddest part of that Andre documentary was the very end when they're interviewing, Tim White, and he's got tears in his eyes and he's breaking down when he's talking about the day that Andre passed away. He said, his biggest regret is that Andre died alone in a hotel room, and he wishes that he could have been there with him. And that to me was the saddest part of the entire documentary. When I think of Tim White, I also think of the friendly tap. That's what I tweeted about when I posted a picture of me and him. I said, the friendly tap. That was the bar that he owned. It was in Cumberland, Rhode Island, which is where he was born. And many times over the years, WWE would film segments and skits from the bar. Many times, I remember the APA would tear the shit out of that place. Big barroom brawl, they would destroy it. I'm sure WWE paid to fix it up. But then eventually they'd be back and they would tear it up again. And I don't know that he owned that bar anymore, but for many years he owned the Friendly Tap. But the other thing also, and this is very divisive, controversial, were the lunchtime suicide skits. So the story is that he had fallen into this great depression over his refereeing career coming to an end, because of the shoulder injury. And they filmed these skits. They were all very short. They were anywhere from 60 seconds to maybe 3 minutes. A whole series of skits, and I think in the end there were like 16 of them, where Josh Matthews would interview Tim White, and Tim really wouldn't say a word. He would look depressed. He would look sad and depressed over the fact that his refereeing career was over. And they ran these on WWE.com for like 3 or 4 months. This went on for. I think it ended around the time of WrestleMania 22. But in each one, he would try to kill himself. He was so depressed, he was trying to take his own life. And not that suicide is something that is funny or to be mocked or anything like that, but, again, you watch these segments, and I watched all of them. They were just so ridiculous. He tried to shoot himself, I think in the first one, but he dropped the gun, he shot himself in the foot. He tried to hang himself. He ingested rat poison. He climbed into a bathtub filled with water, and then he electrocuted himself with a toaster oven. He slit his wrists. He taped a plastic bag over his head. He tried to suffocate himself. He tied a brick around his neck. He tried to drown himself in a fish tank, and for some reason they had a camera at the bottom of the fish tank so you could see his face when he did it. Gave himself mad cow disease in another one. He hired a hitman to put a bullet in his head. Were they in bad taste? Of course they were, absolutely. Especially with all the suicides that we've heard about in the wrestling business. And I also think part of the problem was people were extra sensitive to it because it came so soon after Eddie Guerrero died. Now, that wasn't a suicide, but I think Eddie passed away in November, and I think these started the very next month. But they're so stupid, and they were so tongue-in-cheek. I'm not going to lie and say that I didn't laugh at some of them, just because all of these things that he would do to himself. In another one, he dove headfirst into a giant steel fan. And again, they were really hamming it up in these. So Josh Matthews would see him setting these things up, and he would think, "Oh, Mr. White, I see that you've taken up a new hobby. What are you doing? You're fixing fans now." No, he was pulling the grate off, and then he was diving in head first into this giant steel fan. And then I remember they cut to a shot of Josh Matthews with what's supposed to be blood, splattering all over him. It looked like ragu tomato sauce. But then the very next week, Josh would say miraculously, Mr. White suffered only minor injuries. And then here comes Tim White, and he's got a little Band-Aid on his cheek after diving headfirst into this fan. It was so stupid and so ridiculous. But Court Bauer, who was a writer for WWE at the time, he said that White was more than happy to do those skits, since his shoulder problems kept him from refereeing, couldn't referee anymore. And I guess they floated this ridiculous idea to him, and he was game. He's like, "Yeah, let's do it." But obviously a lot of people were not a fan of the lunchtime suicide skits. But quite a career for himself. And again, all-around nice guy based on everybody who knew him, worked with him. He definitely has carved out his place in WWE history. When I think of the famous referees over the years in that company, I think of the Hebners. I think of Dave and Earl Hebner, but I also think of Mike Chioda, and I think of Tim White as well. And again, they were there for a very long time. These are guys that were soldiers in that company for so many years, and very, very sad. And very young, too. 68 is not that old, so I don't know what the cause of death was, but this information is just coming in. But WWE already put out a statement about it, and very sad to hear about his passing. And also very sad to hear about the death of Dave Hebner, the twin brother of Earl Hebner, who passed away on Friday. He was 73 years old, and he had been in poor health for some time. Hermie Sadler, who you may remember, he would make appearances on TNA television from time to time many years ago, former race car driver. He had posted a photo last month from Dave's home. He was posing with Dave and his family, and Dave looked terrible. It was very clear he was sick. I know he had Parkinson's disease. I don't know what other issues or ailments he may have been dealing with, but it was bad. Earl Hebner tweeted, "Yesterday I had to say my last goodbye to my other half, my partner in crime, my road buddy for years, my brother for 73 years. I love you, David. I will never count you out." Dave Hebner started working as a referee for the WWF in the early 80s. He was in the ring for the famous Randy Savage-Ricky Steamboat match at WrestleMania 3. Took a hell of a bump, too, in that match. Earl Hebner was a referee for Jim Crockett Promotions. And in early 88, he jumped from the NWA to the WWF for one of the most memorable angles in wrestling history. And the most widely viewed angle in wrestling history. 33 million people tuned in to see the Hulk Hogan-Andre the Giant rematch on NBC, which is one of my earliest wrestling memories. My earliest memories go back to 87, but that angle in February of 88 is just forever etched in my brain. I cannot put into words how big of a deal it was to see Hulk Hogan lose the WWF Championship after 4 years as champion. They were trying to come up with a way to get the title off of Hogan without beating him clean. Somebody mentioned, it may have been Dave, that he had a twin brother. What about my brother Earl? And so Vince McMahon flew both Hebner twins to his home in Connecticut to pitch the idea for what they planned to do. Ted DiBiase had tried to buy the championship from Hulk Hogan. Hogan refused, and so DiBiase struck up an alliance with Andre the Giant. Dave Hebner was supposed to be the referee for the match, and he was. Or so people thought. Dave Hebner had been locked in a closet in the back, as the story goes, and the referee in the ring was not Dave. It was his evil twin brother Earl, who had been paid off by the dastardly $1 Million Man. So when Andre went to go pin Hogan, and Hogan got his shoulder up, the referee counted 3 anyway, and awarded the title to Andre, who then surrendered the title to Ted DiBiase, who had paid off Andre. And actually, the other thing I will never forget about this, there's a few things that I will never forget about this angle. One of them is that it is the first time that Hogan came to the ring wearing the, at the time, brand new Winged Eagle belt, which is the greatest championship design this company ever had. That's number one. Number two, when Andre won, it was being interviewed in the ring by Mean Gene after the match, and he was surrendering the title to Ted DiBiase. I will never forget him referring to it as the tag team title. I surrender the tag team championship to Ted DiBiase. Andre could barely stand when that match was over. So he surrendered the title to DiBiase. Dave Hebner, all of a sudden, I guess somebody let him out of the closet, and he comes down to the ring after the match, and he's in the ring. We had that great scene of the two Hebner brothers staring each other down in the ring. Remember the two doinks at WrestleMania 9? It was kind of like that. Hogan sees this, and he can't believe what he's seeing. It's like he's got double vision. And later on in the back, when Hogan, he's crying and he's whining, because that's what he did after all. Every time he lost a match, he cried like a bitch. And he's in the back and he's crying and he's screaming, "How much for the plastic surgery, Mean Gene? When I turned around, they were identical." Just a ridiculous promo if you've never seen it. So, but back in the ring, Earl punches Dave in the face. And then he field goal kicked him in the ribcage. And when he did that, Hogan knew who the phony paid-off referee was. He knew who the phony Dave Hebner was. And then Hogan picks up Earl and he launched him into the aisle. He almost fucking killed him. He was supposed to throw him, and DiBiase and Andre and Virgil would catch him. But he threw him so hard, he overshot his target. And poor Earl, he took a nasty landing. But Dave, he kept refereeing for a while. Eventually, he had to get knee replacement surgery, so he transitioned out of the ring into the back as a road agent. And for years, it would annoy me to no end when Jesse Ventura and other announcers would refer to Earl as Dave Hebner. Because it was always obvious to me that it wasn't Dave. It's like the Usos. I can tell them apart pretty easily. Dave always had the pudgier face. He was a little heavier than Earl. So that's how I was always able to distinguish between the two of them. But it was sad the way that their run came to an end. For all the years they spent in WWE, how their run came to an end there in 2005. They were released after Earl was accused of selling WWE merchandise without the company's permission. He was selling bootleg merch out of a store that he co-owned with somebody else. That was the allegation. This is what Dave told Slam Wrestling in an interview in 2009 about what had happened. He said Earl had a friend in St. Louis named Nick. Nick was making the boys WWF shirts because they wanted the shirts. So Earl and Nick went in as partners on the store. The store, by the way, that he's referencing, I'm almost positive, is the same pro wrestling shirt shop that I visited on my one trip to St. Louis many years ago. Which, that's a whole other story. I know I've talked about that on the podcast before, my experience at that mall. I think it was the South County Mall. I didn't even know they had a wrestling t-shirt shop in the building. I was there for a client store opening, and I'm wandering around the mall, and you can imagine I see this marquee that has pro wrestling on it. It's like these things on TV shows where this heavenly music starts to play and everything gets dark and a spotlight shines on it. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And they had a lot more than just t-shirts in that store. They had a ton of stuff in there. And the St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame at the time, if this is the store I'm thinking of, the St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame was housed in the back of the store, which was just a display with various pictures and plaques, and they had the old ring bell mounted on the wall. That was basically the Hall of Fame. So I'm almost positive it's the same store. But in any event, Earl was partners with this guy on the store. I don't believe Dave was involved, at least not officially. I don't think Dave was involved in the store. But he said at the time, the rule was you weren't supposed to do it. Earl told the guy, don't make anything. It's not legal for anybody. Well, Rich Herring went down there and he saw a hat, I guess, the guy had made him. And then when we went to TVs in Philadelphia, they fired Earl. And he told me that I was suspended. For those who don't know, Rich Herring is a longtime WWE employee. I think he's been working there over 50 years. He still works there for the company. He was the one who received the Warrior Award last year. Dave continues, he says, coming back, he told me the reason they fired me, which they did end up firing him, I was taking bids under the counter for the concessions where everybody eats their lunch. That is a barefaced lie. I've never stole anything from Vince McMahon. As a matter of fact, I've saved him money. I've caught people stealing his money, Jack Tunney for one. I've never stolen anything. They just wanted us all out of there. I still can't believe Vince did that. I just can't believe it. Because when we went to Vince's house to talk about the Hogan and Andre match, Vince was so good to us. Vince was good to me for 27 years. I've never had a bad day at all. It broke my heart. I had depression over the last 5 years just thinking about what I lost and how they let me go for nothing. Earl denies and has always denied that he did anything wrong, but that was always the belief, is that he got fired for selling bootleg merch. Dave was only suspended initially, but he was fired later after they investigated further, so they obviously uncovered something that they didn't like. But either way, it was a pretty shitty way for their run there to end. I grew up on the Hebners. Some people grew up watching Tommy Young referee matches. I grew up watching Earl and Dave. And Joey Morella and Tim White. So I was very sad to hear about them both passing away.